Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now to the US presidential election campaign. They're calling them the supporting cast, and according to one editorial, it's time for the deputies to step out of the shadows and to bask in the spotlight. In a few hours' time, the US vice presidential candidates will be on a debate stage in Utah to go head-to-head for the first and only time in what analysts are calling a landmark moment. In one corner, Kamala Harris, the woman who aspires to be the first female vice president in history. She's built a reputation as one of the toughest interrogators in Congress. On the other side of the Mason-Dixon line, in a manner of speaking, an unflappable Republican vice president who rarely puts a foot wrong under intense media questioning. Correspondents say vice presidential debates don't usually trouble presidential historians too much, but this year the drama of the election campaign could heighten interest in how the two fare against each other.
Be an excellent debate. I certainly wouldn't underestimate Mike Pence after the performance that he delivered in 2016. There's so much at stake this time. There's a lot of pressure on him. Both candidates have taken this debate extremely seriously.
Things have not been moving in the right direction for the Trump-Pence ticket. So I think that really probably changes the trajectory of Vice President Pence will really need to be on offense.
Well, I think Senator Harris's goals easier to describe. She's just going to establish herself as a legitimate vice presidential candidate who is equipped to move into the presidency if the need arose.
Well, for more on that hugely anticipated debate, let's speak now to the former media director of the U.S. Commission on Presidential Debates, John Scardina, who is the spokesman for Democrats Abroad UK. Good to see you, John, and thank you very much indeed for joining us. There's quite a lot at stake here, isn't there?
I think a lot more so than previous vice presidential debates, as some of your commentators were saying in the piece leading up to our discussion here. There is intense scrutiny right now, and things are not going all that well for President Trump in his campaign. And I think it's going to be particularly difficult for Mr. Pence tonight, because he's been the one who was given the task by President Trump in February to be the lead person on the White House coronavirus task force. So, you know, a lot of what's happened since February has been under the watch of Mr. Pence. So it's going to be very difficult to talk about almost anything else other than COVID-19 and the risks of the coronavirus spreading even further.
Well, absolutely, because of course the pandemic has claimed the lives of more than 200,000 Americans and hospitalized his boss. So not brilliant credentials to take into the debate.
No, and it's really interesting when you compare this to the former Vice President Joe Biden. He was given a similar task in a time of national crisis in 2009. You remember when he and Barack Obama were elected in 2008. They took office in January of 2009. And the crisis at that time was the financial crisis that had happened the year before in 2008. Banks were on the verge of closing. The American automobile industry was in dire straits and was looking for a way to get back on its feet. Hundreds of homes across the country were being repossessed because people had big mortgages that they couldn't afford to pay, and they couldn't get more money. The credit crisis was preventing them from getting money to service their mortgages. So when Obama and Biden came into office in 2009, President Obama put Joe Biden in charge of the recovery of addressing that financial crisis at the time. And the success of that was really extraordinary. It led to a historic trend of job creation from 2009 right up until the time that Obama and Biden left office. And I think that's an amazing track record that the Biden campaign has going into this election. Whereas, as I say, in contrast, Vice President Pence has been in charge of managing the government response to the coronavirus crisis, and it's been a terribly mismanaged, unsuccessful response to this crisis. They can't even seem to keep the White House free from the virus.
Of course, on the other side of the fence, Kamala Harris making history because she could become the first woman of color to take up the position of Vice President of the United States if the Democrats win in November. In fact, the first woman who, of any color.
I think she's a very exciting candidate. I really do. I think she's very capable. We got to see a good bit of her during her own run for president earlier this year. She is, of course, I think, been a very successful senator. She is known to be a very sharp prosecutor. So I think she brings a lot of talent to the Biden campaign and would be a fantastic vice president if we're successful in November.
And of course, John, you were the media director of the U.S. Commission on Presidential Debates, the group that's organizing tonight's debate. And this is the first and only vice presidential debate, as I understand it. After tonight's encounter, there won't be another.
That's right. This is the usual format, going back to 1988, when the commission took over the responsibility for producing the debates. They've always, in every election year, they've had 3 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate. Now, as a number of your commentators were saying just before I came on, the limelight for the vice presidential debates has been in the past fairly non-existent. It's often seen as a much more minor event. But this year, I do think it is quite significant. Number one, because of the role that the Vice President Pence has played in supposedly managing or mismanaging the White House response to the coronavirus crisis. And also because of the role that we know that vice presidents can play, as I say, comparing Pence's capabilities or lack thereof to the success that Biden had in February of 2009 in managing the economic recovery after the financial crisis of 2008. So I think that there's a lot of attention right now on the role of the vice president. And I think Kamala Harris presents some very exciting abilities and brings some really interesting skills to this campaign.
And just drilling down at the role of the vice president some more, by constitution, I understand they preside over the Senate, but of course they also take over if the president dies or resigns.
That's right. So there is a line of succession that's spelled out in the Constitution. If the president, not only obviously if he dies in office, if there is a tragedy like that, as we saw in 1963 when John Kennedy was assassinated, the vice president then is immediately sworn in and takes over the executive office of the president. But even if the president should become incapacitated for some period of time, and this happened very briefly with Ronald Reagan, if the president becomes incapacitated, if he's hospitalized and has to go under anesthesia, for example, and is not able to carry out the responsibilities of the office, then on a temporary basis, decision-making could be transferred to the vice president. Now, what's really interesting in this situation also is that if in the event that the president is either dead or can't perform his duties, and the same thing happens to the vice president, then the next person in line is the Speaker of the House, who in this case, of course, is Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic Congresswoman from California. So there's some very interesting scenarios that could play out between now and January 20th, 21st, when the inauguration takes place. Whoever is elected in November, the next president isn't sworn in, as you know, until the 3rd week of January. So if something were to happen between now and then, it could be that Vice President Pence takes over or Nancy Pelosi were to take over. After that, if Joe Biden has been elected in November, which we're hoping that he will be, and the polls, by the way, are showing some extraordinary growth in the support for Joe Biden. There were two very significant polls that came out after the last presidential debate. One of them from the Wall Street Journal, which is, as you know, a fairly conservative media outlet, and the other from CNN, which is perhaps considered a little bit more of a liberal media outlet. And both of them showed double-digit increases in support for Mr. Biden over Mr. Trump as a result of the performance in the debate last week. So it could be, depending on how things go tonight, there could be even more support growing towards the Biden campaign. But we'll see how it goes.
Well, absolutely. We're all watching, and we're going to be digesting those numbers as they come out. But let me just take you up on that issue of the polls, because I mean, those polls couldn't be trusted in 2016. Why should they be trusted now? Because I mean, from what I gather, there are a lot of Trump supporters who will not take a poll and who regularly turn down poll requests.
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, and I don't deny there are. I think polls are just one measure of how things are going, but they're one of the only measures that we have. We won't really know until Election Day. Now, there are estimates that something like 5 million people have already voted by absentee ballot and by turning up at polling stations where early voting is allowed. I believe today is the first day of voting for anybody who wanted to vote early in the state of Ohio, for example. And I've seen some video footage. The lines at the polling stations are out the door, around the block, and down the street. I mean, it is extraordinary, the number of people who are voting already and are determined to vote. But to answer your question about polling and the legitimacy of polling, in relation to the debates, one of the things that the commission does when deciding what candidates to invite to the presidential debates, you may remember in the past we've had third-party candidates. There was Ralph Nader in 2000, and before that in 1992 and in 96, Ross Perot ran for president as a third-party candidate, not as a Democrat or as a Republican. And Ross Perot gained, I believe, in 92 something like 15% of the vote, an extraordinary success for an independent candidate. He had been invited to participate in the debates, but Ralph Nader was not invited to participate in the debates in 2000. And Ralph Nader took this issue all the way to the Supreme Court in 2000 and claimed that he should have been invited as a legitimate candidate. And the way that the commission decides which candidates get to participate in these debates or not is they use what the media and everybody else does. They use a number of polls that have been taken to see how much support is there for a particular candidate. And in Ralph Nader's case, there was less than, I think, 5% support for his candidacy in 2000. So it was just one of the factors that was used to make the argument that he should not be included in the debates, that he didn't have a realistic chance of winning the presidency, in other words. So yes, I think that polling should always be taken with some grain of salt, as they say, but they are, something to be considered. And when you have organizations like the Wall Street Journal and CNN conducting polling, journalists, as you know, are a skeptical bunch already, and they are two very credible outlets. So,
okay. John, I want to thank you very much indeed. Very interesting. John Scardina is the spokesman for Democrats Abroad UK and former media director of the US Commission on Presidential Debates. And we'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Enier-Gould. Now, the fact that the US president has been seriously ill has reminded the American public they have the two oldest presidential candidates in history. And both vice presidential debaters tonight will be aware they have to present themselves as ready to step into the world's biggest job. This week has, of course, been dominated by President Trump's coronavirus infection and its impact on the election that's just 28 days from now. The virus has killed more than 200,000 Americans, and it dominates the campaign and is sure to feature heavily in tonight's debate. Mr. Trump and his Democrat opponent, Joe Biden, have been promoting their very different approaches to battling the virus and the handling of it by the Trump administration. The polls are very worrying for the president right now, showing a consistent lead for Mr. Biden. Well, for his analysis of the upcoming debate and the latest political developments in the US, I'm joined now by Arise special correspondent Carl Bostic. Great to see you, Carl, and thank you for giving us the benefit of your analysis. Is it fair to say that this vice presidential debate tonight is likely to be the most important in American political history so far?
Well, just to kind of put things in perspective, Charles, the short answer is possibly so, and the reason why is this. As a rule, the vice presidential debates don't really draw a big TV viewing audience because, you know, when it comes to presidential elections, that's exactly what they are. Voters, they're voting for the president. They're not voting for the vice president. You have to really kind of go through history books to find out when was the last memorable vice presidential debate, and that's when Lloyd Bentsen was telling Dan Quayle back in the 80s, saying, Senator Quayle,
John F. Kennedy.
You know John F. Kennedy.
Right.
And Quayle tried to
I remember
himself.
that.
But that's the last memorable one. But this one, the stakes are much, much, much higher, Charles, because for one, this is not only the coronavirus pandemic debate, which is going to affect the way in which it's presented, but it's also one in which we're looking more closely at two people who could be future presidential contenders. But in terms of this being the pandemic debate, separate from the way the format is, let's keep in mind this, as you rightly pointed out, you've got a president who's been discharged from the hospital who's still positive, who's still contagious. It's not even clear if he'll be able to not only return to the campaign trail, but even participate in the debate next week. Joe Biden has said there's no way we're going to debate. Well, of course we want to debate, but only when he's negative. The point is this, Charles, this could very well, unless we know that he's been given the clear signal by doctors, President Trump that is, this could very well be the remaining last debate. So there's that to consider. So in that respect, Charles, the stakes are very, very high in that respect, because not only could be the last debate, but now when you look at what's the tasks ahead for Mike Pence and then for Kamala Harris, they're quite daunting. In fact, I think we first of all have a slide to show you why this is going to be the coronavirus debate. If we have a slide that we can show you about how this is going to be set up in Utah. Well, it's going to happen at a student convention center at the University of Utah. They will each, Kamala Harris, Mike Pence, and Susan Page, she's the moderator from USA Today, the newspaper, they'll be separated by 12 feet, 3 inches apart from each other. That's an increase from the 7 feet that Trump and Biden were separated by plexiglass dividers. All attendees will be wearing masks. What's different from the last debate, Charles, if you recall, when the president's family arrived with masks, they then took it off. And the convention hall staff asked them to please put the masks back on or else gave them masks, and they refused to. And afterwards, it turns out 11 members of the staff of the convention hall turned positive, not necessarily because of that, but as a principle, as a guiding rule. And then if we look at some more information about what to expect, I think we have another slide to show you, Charles, about what to expect here in terms of testing. Everyone has to be tested before entering the debate hall. So there's that. And then the audience is very interesting, Charles. It's a student convention center hall. 2,000 capacity, only 50 students will be admitted. They're given places by lottery, and they have to take a test and show that they've passed a negative. So that in itself will make it very, very unusual, if you will.
So given all that, Carl, do you think this debate tonight could play a significant part in tipping the balance one way or the other?
Well, again, as I said, returning to what I was mentioning a moment ago, Mike Pence is a tall order, because let's just step back and think about, first of all, the defining issue is going to be the handling of the coronavirus. And he's going to be asked some really, really tough questions. He's going to be asked, for example, just returning to President Trump's hospitalization, he's going to be asked, why did the president allow for events to be held in crowded situations without a mask, without social distancing, at which numerous people were then infected at both the White House and public events associated with the White House? Why was the president, after being hospitalized, when he was still positive, going around in a hermetically sealed SUV when he was technically exposing himself to Secret Service agents? Why was the president, after returning to the White House, taking off his mask, surrounded by White House staff, and still, when he was testing positive and still contagious? And then finally, he's saying, don't be afraid of COVID. Don't let it dominate your lives. And then yesterday, he was tweeting that he would call off talks for the coronavirus relief bill, and then changing his mind hours later. All of this is what Mike Pence is not only going to have to answer to, but also because it's Mike Pence who is the head of the White House coronavirus task force.
Very interesting. And this debate, of course, coming after a first Trump term that's turned some lifelong Republicans into Democrats, from what I'm hearing. Many of them turned off by what they say is the division, the toxic rhetoric, the escalating tensions brought on by issues around the coronavirus and racial justice.
That's right. In fact, Charles, I think we have another slide we can show you about how people feel about Kamala Harris and Mike Pence.
Okay, I'm just told we don't have that, apparently.
We don't have that. Okay. Well, very simply, that's why, for those kinds of reasons you're talking about, that's why, voters in a preliminary poll expect Kamala Harris to perform better than Mike Pence by around 45 to 35%. But to get to your point, Charles, a good example, for example, is the battleground state of Pennsylvania. It's Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan that put him over by a total of less than 80,000 votes. That's what gave him the election over Hillary Clinton, 80,000 votes. He won Pennsylvania by less than 1%. As things stand today, with polls coming out of Pennsylvania yesterday, Joe Biden is about 10 points ahead of Donald Trump. And it's because of those kinds of moderate Republicans that you're talking about. And yet, up until a few days ago, people were saying that it's not over until it's over, because that's why they have October surprise. I mean, today is a very interesting date itself, Charles. It's 4 years ago to the day, Charles, October 7th, 2016, when those notorious Access Hollywood tapes were released. Tapes that showed him bragging about his prowess and his handling of women in very misogynistic ways, which people thought would doom his campaign, but which he nonetheless overcame.
Absolutely.
But what's also different this time is Charles, is that unlike 2016, where he was the outsider and he was saying, I alone can fix this, he's now standing on a record. He's now the incumbent. So, for example, you're talking about violence and racial unrest, whatever. It's happening on his watch.
And we've got about a minute and a half to go. After that first presidential debate that many feel was neither presidential nor a debate, presumably tonight voters will be looking to the vice presidential candidates to focus more on policy.
Well, the thing about it, Charles, is it will certainly be much more civil compared to last week. And last week, where you had more than 70 interruptions from President Trump.
Free for all, basically.
It was a free for all, like a bun fight. It'll be very, very civil. That doesn't mean that it won't still show the deep divisions in the country, because they're going to be showing two entirely different realities and such. And that's a test for Mike Pence. I think Kamala Harris, she'll use her prosecutorial skills to go after that. And if anything, it'll also be a spotlight on someone who could be the front runner as a presidential candidate in 2024.
It all sounds really fascinating. I know you're going to be staying up to watch it. I'm going to try and stay up.
And again,
as well.
Getting back to Kamala Harris,
briefly.
Another point to keep in mind. She's a trailblazer, since that she's the first woman of color as a running mate on a major party who could potentially become the vice president, the first woman of color ever.
Absolutely.
So everyone will really be looking at that, and that's really part of the fascination with her.
Okay, well, we're all going to be looking out for that. And Carl, I I'm always impressed with your knowledge of American politics and also your ability to put it all in perspective for us using your fancy graphics and all that sort of thing. Thank you ever so much. Carl Bostic is Arise special correspondent, and he was giving us a preview there of what to expect in tonight's US vice presidential debate. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja and Lagos, and of course the United States. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.